takes care of everything from the entire pipeline of single particle analysis. There's also some tomography in there, but mostly it's used for single particle cryo-EM. And the general pipeline looks kind of like this. You have your raw movies coming in, and you do some kind of motion corrections on them and turn them into single image or micrographs, and then you pinpoint your particles. You extract those as little boxes that contain these particles as little box images, basically. And then you put that into a refinement algorithm, which lies at the sort of at the heart of this entire pipeline that either in 2D or 3D. I'm going to be mainly focused on 3D here, but these algorithms are interchangeably applicable to both 2D and 3D reconstruction, where basically what you do is you take your data or images, your stack of thousands or millions of images, and then you iteratively use those to reconstruct and refine a model, a 3D model or a 2D model of something that looks like a protein, and eventually using that data, it becomes more and more similar to what you have in your images. And this is done in Relion currently. It's done using something called expectation maximization. And the expectation maximization is kind of built up of two steps, the expectation step and the maximization step. What you see in this figure here is mainly the expectation step, where you accumulate, so basically you take slices, projection images of your 3D model, your initial guess, and then you compare those projections with your images, and then you back project those images back into 3D volume, and you use that that's the expectation step, and then you use that back projected information, that statistics, in the maximization step, where you convert this into the next guess for your model. And then you plug this back into the start of this cycle, and you do this iteratively, and eventually, if the theory is correct and everything is done right and your data isn't too bad, you will get to a high resolution reconstruction, hopefully seeing side chains or at least secondary structures, or in this specific application, that's the idea. Now there's been a lot of effort put into trying to push the resolution of these reconstructed models to higher and higher resolution by addressing some of the different issues. There are a lot of issues. There's a lot of issues, and a lot of them are related to the physics, microscope physics. Some of them are related to computational issues, limitations in computational power that was addressed by GPU acceleration, for instance, but also, for instance, another example would be Multibody, where the flexibility in the model was addressed by allowing the user to input some prior information about what parts of your biomolecule that are flexible relative to each other, and then this protocol basically reconstruct those individual parts, push the resolution of those individual parts further, and then you can also get some statistics about the flexibility in your model. A lot of other effort has been put into pushing the high end of the resolution further and further. And by high end, I mean that you have a model that goes to a fairly good, to pretty high level of details, where you can start seeing, for instance, here individual side chains, and then you can use these algorithms to push your resolution further and further. And some of them address the limitations in the microscope physics, whereas some other ones, like for instance, Bayesian polishing, addresses some of the computational limitations, like for instance, the fact that motion correction doesn't go all the way, and you can actually improve on the motion correction results. Now, there are a lot of data sets that you don't see published or you don't hear about because they never really went to higher resolution. There are a lot of them that sort of stops at maybe 10 angstrom or even 8 or 6 angstrom that people can't really use to do proper biology on. And kind of the work that when I got involved in this, the aim was to try to get those data sets to go to higher resolution, to actually enter this regime where you can start applying these kind of algorithms to it to try to push the resolution even further. But before we get into that, and I should just mention, this was published in a preprint recently, and this talk is going to be heavily focused on that preprint. But before we get into that, just a quick recap of Bayes' theorem, where generally, if you just, it doesn't have to be in the context of cryo-EM refinement. It could be in the context of any type of scientific endeavor where you have some kind of theory or some kind of model that you call X, and you have your data, some type of data that you collected. The probability of that model given your data is proportional to the probability of basically the flipped probability, where the data is dependent, or the model is given, and then the probability of that data given that model, and then times this little thing here, which is the probability of that model in general without the data given. And this is commonly called, so this would be the posterior, this is the likelihood, and this would be the prior probability. And this talk will be much more focused on the prior part, which hasn't been really addressed that much in cryo-EM. Specifically in cryo-EM, X would be your reconstructed density, your model, and Y would be your projection images in a single particle cryo-EM. And in tomography, it would be your tomograms or subtomograms. And well, these two forms here are equivalent because of the properties of the log function. And basically what happens is that when you apply log on both sides of this equation, you split up these two terms into a sum instead of a multiplication here, and you get a term that is the likelihood term, or the log likelihood term, and the log prior term. And these are mathematically equivalent, but computationally, this form is much more easier to handle because you can basically handle these separately. Now, in the context of reconstruction, we talk about maximum a posteriori in the sense that your posterior probability, you're trying to basically maximize your posterior probability that we define as our target function. This term here, the log likelihood function is very simple in a sense that it's pretty much given if you make certain assumptions. And usually people use a Gaussian model where they basically, in the figure that I showed you, when you compare your projection images with your projection, when you do projection matching, where you compare your projections of your model with the projection images from your raw data, that becomes this term. And this is sometimes called the data fidelity term, because this term brings in the data and compares that to the model, whereas this term only handles the model, and it doesn't really care about the data. However, the most common way of, so I won't mention what this term looks like because it's really not relevant in this case, but it's basically just a comparison between the projections of the model and the data. Whereas this term usually is assigned to something like this, an exponential prior, basically exponential prior probability. And in this case, it's an empirical prior, so it actually does care a bit about the data. And the way it cares about the data is this parameter here, the tau parameter. And people that have been used Relion, they are familiar with something called the tau fudge factor, which affects this parameter here. And what this parameter is it's basically based on the FSC between, so if you're doing your reconstruction, you usually, in the final steps, you split your data halves, your data into two halves. and you reconstruct them separately. And then you can calculate a correlation for your shell correlation between these two reconstructions to get some kind of a confidence about how much you trust your data. If you have high correlation between your maps, that means that you have a reconstruction that you have high confidence in. And what you can do is that you put more confidence into your data term, and you can reduce your prior assumptions. You don't have to make as much prior assumptions about your data. So what happens is that because there's a minus sign here, or sorry, it's a power to tau to the power of -1. When tau is large, you have lower. You basically lower the effect of the prior, and when tau is small, you increase the effect of this prior. And I'm going to come back to this expression here. It might not be completely clear what this means, but I'm going to come back to it real soon. But what happens is if we define these two quantities, this looks really messy right now, but I sort of need to have it there just so that you've seen it, but you don't have to understand exactly this. But just briefly, this is basically B here is basically an expectation over a back projection, or an expectation over your data, reconstructed into place back into your Fourier volume. So B basically becomes your back projected images into 3D volume, whereas K becomes a measure of the amount of signal that goes into each slice. It's basically based on the CTF. And when you do this, the update, if you remember in the image that I showed you, the update, if you consider an iteration n, like n could be, in the first iteration, n would be 1, and then second iteration would be 2. You can, using these expressions, define what your next guess should look like using the current model. So if you take your current model, the current x for iteration n, and you plug it into B, and you plug that also into K, what happens using all of this theory, basically, it boils down through the expectation maximization algorithm it boils down to basically this update formula. It's a very compact representation, but it shows how actually, all of this math can be simplified to something that looks so simple. It's quite amazing. And what this says is this is basically a Wiener filter. And what it says is that tau, that was our confidence in our data, says that if tau to the power of -2 is very small, then you have very high confidence in your data in the B here, and you end up basically allowing it to migrate into your next guess in a much higher at a much higher level. Whereas if you have less confidence in your data, this tau to the power of -2 becomes larger, and you end up suppressing those Fourier components that you have little confidence in. So tau, I should mention, because it's based on the FSC, you have different values for different Fourier components. So what happens is that you end up regularizing. And this is regularization is basically saying something about how much you suppress different Fourier components depending on how much confidence you have in them. So you end up regularizing different Fourier components differently depending on how much confidence you have in them, and and how much information you allow to be propagated into the next iteration. Now, just a quick visualization of what this kind of looks like. This prior, what it says is that we want smooth reconstructions, and if you actually apply this to an image, this could be an image of a molecule, or it could be an image of someone holding a duck in a field of sunflowers. Doesn't really matter. The theory is kind of the same. What it says is that we don't prefer this type of image. this type of image is too noisy. It contains too much, we're putting too much confidence in the high frequency components in this image. So if we apply this type of prior, and this is the reason why this type of prior sometimes is called the smoothness prior, because it's based on the prior assumption that your reconstructions should be more smooth. And so we're saying that molecules or this image of this duck should be smooth. This is what we a priori can assume. And that's basically the only information that this prior introduces into the reconstruction, that we require things to look smoother rather than, because we know that, you know, proteins, for instance, in the solvent regions shouldn't, the reconstruction shouldn't contain higher frequency noise. It should be smooth. But the thing is that this is a very, very poor amount of information that we're inputting into our reconstruction. We know a lot more about proteins and biomolecules in general. We actually have a tremendous amount of information gathered in the PDB data bank throughout the past decades that tells us a lot about how proteins and biomolecules should look like. We know, for instance, that they are made up of amino acids that sort of come together to form secondary structures, and these form protein domains that fold into protein complexes. This is a rich amount of information that we know about proteins a priori before we start our reconstruction. So how do we plug this? How do we utilize this information? You know, smoothing them out is one way. Some other is you know, it's introducing a little bit of that information by smoothing it out. But some other things that you can do is, like, for instance, solvent flattening, where you introduce a mask where you tell the program that I know this region should be flat. That's another type of prior information. These aren't really based on some kind of robust approach. They are kind of ad hoc, in a sense that someone came up with that this is probably a good thing. They tried it out and it kind of worked. We need a much more systematic way of introducing all of this information, as much as possible of this information, into our reconstruction. So how do we do that? So far, it's been pretty difficult to bring in this amount of information into something like a reconstruction. But recently, neural networks have become, in particular, convolutional neural networks have become very, very famous. And the reason they are they have become so hyped up is mainly because they introduced this new approach that is called the data-driven approach. So if you have a lot of data, you can use neural networks to basically extract information or extract patterns out of your data that you can then apply in something like a reconstruction that we do. And it turns out that we have a lot of data, right? And now we have this framework, convolutional networks, that we can use to plug that data into our reconstructions. This has been done before in image reconstruction through multiple different ways. Mainly, regularization by denoising is a kind of a mathematical framework for plugging in a denoiser. It could be any type of denoiser, but convolutional neural networks as denoisers have been pretty successful. So that denoiser can be a convolutional neural network. So that would be regularization by denoising using a convolutional network. There's also this other approach that is called adversarial regularization, or AR. The difference between these two approaches is that regularization by denoising is basically, it can be made up of an autoencoder, which consists of an encoder and a decoder. So you have your input image, or in our case, our input volume. And then we encode it and then decode it back into a denoised output volume. Also, UNets have been much more successful in this case, where you don't have an encoder and decoder, where you have something different. Adversarial regularizers, on the other hand, they don't have the decoder. They are only basically made up of the encoder. And they are, if you like, the bottom half of a generative adversarial network, where the critic or the discriminator is basically the network that you use. And then you can use that to generate a gradient on how you should bias your reconstruction to input the prior knowledge from what the network have learned. But this talk and the project that I've worked on has mainly been focused on regularization by denoising, or use a denoiser to do the regularization. And the reason for that is basically because we tried both, and the first one turned out to be the most stable one. But there is still some work going on with the adversarial regularizers as well. But this project ended up being only presenting the results from the red approach. Now, if you train a denoiser, the way we did it was we generated a bunch of, you need a lot of data, right? The problem is that we don't really have a lot of data for cryo-EM reconstructions, because cryo-EM is still pretty fresh and there's not a lot of reconstructions out there that we can use to train our network. So we had to simulate our data using the protein data bank. Now I'm going to come back to this, but there are ongoing efforts to try to push this to real data as well. But this paper will be, this talk will be focused on results for simulated data. Just a proof of concept, basically. And what happens when you train a denoiser to take you from a noisy image to a less noisy image, if you like, and then you apply it to different resolutions regimes, you get something like this. In this case, this first column is the input to the denoiser, and this is the output of the denoiser, and this is the ground truth. So you can see here that in the very low resolution domain, the denoiser is capable of getting rid of some of these rotational smearing artifacts. But in the higher resolution domain, the denoiser is very good at removing the background noise, and it basically has learned to create a solvent flattening mask. And applies it to the reconstruction. So I hope this kind of gives the idea of what we're doing here. We're not explicitly saying that the algorithm should do solvent flattening or that it should remove these artifacts. We're actually letting the data guide us. The data shows us that if the ground truth looks like this and the noisy image looks like this, then something like this is a much better next guess than this that contains all of these artifacts or this background noise. So that's kind of the new part of this idea that we're not hard coding, manually building these things into the reconstruction algorithms, but we're letting the data guide us. And doing that, there should be a lot of other patterns that we haven't seen that is present in the data that the network will be able to pick up. And that's kind of our hope. Now, the denoiser that we used is, as you can see here, this graph shows how well the network performs. So if you divide the difference between the input and the ground truth, if you divide the difference between the output and the ground truth with the difference between the input and the ground truth for the L1 and L2, you get something like this. So you can see that for lower solutions, the network doesn't improve that much on the L1 norm or the L1 error until around 10 angstrom resolution, where it sort of starts improving quite a lot. And the error becomes smaller and smaller. And then around 4 angstrom, it kind of caps in how much more it can introduce into how much more information it can actually bring into the reconstruction. So this is a single run. If you run the denoiser a single time without doing an iterative reconstruction, this is just running this denoiser once with the input and comparing that to the ground truth. Now, how do we plug this? Now, the specifics of this, how to plug this into the reconstruction comes along with this framework that I mentioned briefly which is called RED, or regularization by denoising. And this framework kind of tells us we had to make a lot of innovation regarding how this should be specifically applied to cryo-EM to make it work. So we say that it is inspired by regularization by denoising, but it's quite similar in a sense. And what we ended up with is a prior, is a gradient of the prior that looks like something like this. We say that the gradient of the log prior is approximately equal to this tau parameter here times the output of the denoiser. So X is the input, the current guess, if you like, and the output of the denoiser. So that gets inputted into F, which is the denoiser, and then the output of that denoiser is placed here, minus the current image. So this becomes basically, this is the weight decay, the exponential prior, what came out of the exponential prior basically after we apply the gradient to it. And then it gets basically very slightly modified with the output of the denoiser. And if you do this, if you remember the update formula that I showed you before, if you do this instead of the exponential prior, you get an expression that looks like this. And you see that if you compare it to the previous one, is that we basically add this additional term up here, which is the output of the denoiser times this little lambda parameter here that I'm going to be talking about in a brief moment here, times the tau parameter. And then this becomes an iterative scheme where you have your previous guess plugged in here, and then you get your next guess outputted here. And you can run this iteratively using your denoiser. And these are some of the results. Now, if you train a denoiser using Gaussian noise, if you just apply Gaussian noise to it, you get something that looks like the green curve here. And there's a lot of curves here, so let me just go through that. The columns here are different PDB models. This is simulated data, and these are different. So the rows are different SNR levels. This is the worst SNR level, the lowest SNR level, and this is the highest SNR level. And empirically, we noticed that this PDB was the most difficult to reconstruct because of the size and the form of this PDB, whereas this one was the most easiest one to reconstruct, and this one was the most difficult one. And these curves shows the FSC for at different resolution for comparing to the ground truth. So the solid line here show comparing to the ground truth, and the dotted lines here shows comparing the two half maps. If you compare the correlation between the two half maps that I also mentioned. And you can see if you train a denoiser using only Gaussian noise, so if you take your ground truth and you apply Gaussian noise to it, and you train your denoiser to go from that Gaussian noise distorted image to your ground truth, and you plug that into your reconstruction, we get the green curve here. Whereas if you train it on actual Relion reconstructions, so you know what your ground truth is because we simulated the data, and you have a bunch of Relion reconstructions. We basically ran Relion a lot of times on a bunch of different data sets and generated a bunch of different intermediate Relion results. If you train your denoiser to go from those to your ground truth, that's when you get these purple curves here. So basically, Gaussian distorted images don't represent, they're not able to teach the denoiser all the different artifacts that you actually encounter in reconstruction. And obviously using Relion intermediates is better. And you can actually see that in the results here. And this gray area here is basically how good you can get. This is the when you reconstruct using the known angles. And I should mention here that because we simulated our data, we were able to do this analysis very, very thoroughly. We know exactly what angles we have, and we know that we only have a single class. We can control all of these things, and that was the main reason we went with simulated data for this proof of concept. Now, for the intermediate reconstruction, basically this is the best results that we got, and you can see that for the same type of setup where you have rows, SNRs, and columns being the different models, we can see that the angles, the actual reconstructed angles, the estimates of the angles, the error in the angles are much better. The errors are much lower. So if this is what you would like it to look like, that you have perfect, that you have very little angle. So these are different degrees or errors in degrees. So the further out you have, the further to the right, the more error you had in your reconstruction, basically. So if you have very little, less than 5 degrees error, then you kind of look like this for all of your particles. So this is basically all throughout the entire data set for a single reconstruction. And the black bars are regular Relion reconstruction, whereas red is using regularization by denoising. And you see that as the SNR goes down, these curves flatten out and you get more errors that are above 90 degrees. And in this case, we see that we have, both the regular Relion and the regularization by denoising are doing pretty poorly. But in basically all of these cases, regularization by denoising is getting the angles more accurately. And this is a pretty important point, because it's not about, in the end, it's not about introducing features from previously known structures into your reconstructions. It's about iteratively at each step in your reconstruction improving things in a way so that your angles become better, so that you can align your projection images better. And once you do that, once your angles are actually getting better, then you're actually putting something in there that helps the reconstruction along the line. So, it reduces kind of the risk of creating something that isn't there. But yeah, and these are some slices of what the different reconstructions look like. These are the ground truth, and the different columns here are still the different models and the different SNR levels. And we see that the background noise is looking much better in the, so I should say that the right column in each, the right image in each column is the red regularization by denoising approach, and the left one is the regular Relion reconstruction. And we see that the background noise is much better in basically all of the ones to the right, and we see that they are much more closer to the ground truth, which also we saw in the angles and the FSC curves. And also a bit more close up is isosurfaces. This would be the ground truth for 2 different reconstructions. The top row is the regular Relion reconstruction. The middle one is regularization by denoising, and the bottom one is ground truth, and we see that we get pretty close. Now, we did have an issue with, because these are, in a sense, generative, it's a generative approach. We're trying to introduce prior information into our reconstruction. There is always a concern that you're introducing something that's not really there. We did encounter that issue for the really, really most difficult cases. And you can see in this, for that specific, very, really difficult case, you see that when using the regular Relion reconstruction, this is what you get, a very blobby looking thing, because it was the signal to noise ratio was very low. And if you low pass filter your ground truth to the same resolution, it kind of looks, looks similar. It's blobby, it doesn't have that much. But if you just apply this red approach, you get something like this. And you can see here that it's not at all similar to the ground truth. It's basically a freak. It's hallucinating things that aren't there. I mean, there's like a stalk here that's not at all present here. And so this was an issue for the regularization approach regularization by denoising approach trying too hard. And the way we handle this is by introducing the confidence that we have in the denoiser. By going back to this figure, we see that we have very little confidence when we have reconstructions when we're in domains that are around 10 angstrom resolution, and that confidence goes up as we go closer to 4 angstrom, and about around 4 angstrom resolution, that's when it sort of caps off. So that's the maximum confidence in our network. And when we plug this confidence in there, we see that the issue with the hallucination, basically this issue that we have with it trying too hard, kind of goes away, and you get the same result as you get with ordinary Relion, but you still get the same good results as you did before. Now, this is comparing the confidence weighted regularization by denoising with the ordinary regularization by denoising approach. You see that the red curve is pretty much the same as the purple curve everywhere. But if you look at the half map curves, in these two difficult cases, you see that the half map FSC is much more elevated for the difficult cases, for the ordinary regularization by denoising, whereas and this is kind of telling us if the half map FSC, if the correlation between the half maps is too high compared to the FSC compared to the ground truth, that means that the half maps, because we're using the same denoiser, the same prior information in reconstruction, both of the half maps, we're making them more similar to each other than they are to the actual data, than they are to the ground truth. And that's why you get this elevated half map FSC. But you see that for the confidence weighted regularization by denoising, the half map FSC goes back to something very similar to the regular Relion, but the comparison to the ground truth looks as good as before. So I would say that in this case, we were actually able to pretty much eliminate the problem of overfitting that the denoiser introduces. Now, this project was enabled by a newer functionality that was introduced into Relion called the external reconstruct functionality. And if you remember this, if we just focus on the expectation maximization iteration, the external reconstruct functionality allows users to replace the maximization step. So you do the expectation step, where you accumulate statistics into your back projected model, and then you do the maximization step to create the next guess, the next model for the next iteration. But the external reconstruction functionality allows the user to replace that part of the reconstruction algorithm with something they define, a custom script, basically. And this was basically what we used in this project. We replaced the maximization step. If you remember, it was only the maximization formula, the update formula, that was replaced. So we can basically just replace the maximization step. And because we needed to plug in deep learning into a deep learning framework into this, we used TensorFlow. We needed to do this at this stage, at prototyping stage. We needed to do this outside Relion, to do it in Python. And for that, we used the external reconstruction functionality, where we basically get handed the Fourier components, if you remember, this B and the K, these the two quantities that I showed you in those formula for the maximization step. We get handed those in 2 files, and then we get the weights. So 2 files because it's a complex value number. You get 1 imaginary and 1 real number, 2 volumes, and then you get the weights, the K, in a separate file, and then also you get a star file that contains all the statistics, the FSC, and a bunch of other things. And then you can basically, if you like to, you could re-implement the Relion standard maximization in an external Python script, for instance. And then you you would reconstruct a model and then plug that back into back into the Relion reconstruction algorithm, and then Relion sort of continues doing this. This is sort of allows the user to do scripting at the heart of the reconstruction algorithm, which is usually quite difficult. And we hope to introduce more of these kind of hooks, if you like, into Relion to allow users to experiment with other types of algorithms rather than ones that we have previously programmed for. The way you do this is very straightforward. You define environmental variable, the Relion external reconstruct executable. And in this case, I set it equals to Python script that is executed using Python. So you basically give the environmental variable your executable, the command line for running your external script. What Relion does, it appends the path to the star file and to this command line, and that star file will contain the information about the other files that you need for doing this step. So if you set this environmental variable and then you provide Relion with external reconstruct, then Relion can do this for you. And you can look here for an example with code on how to do that. And also there is an example of people outside Shaun's group where they used Site Splitter to improve reconstruction results by specifically using the external reconstruct functionality. Now, just to round this up, what we're working on right now is mainly generating accurate training data that is as similar to real cryo-EM data. And remember, I think I mentioned this that the cryo-EM is pretty fresh and we don't have enough data. So we need to be able to train neural networks. We need to generate a lot of data. And we're working on right now to do this, to generate real data so we can actually move this method into being applied to real data. We need to work on optimizing the network architecture. We haven't put much effort into that. But also there are some upcoming gradient-based methods that should be much more suited for regularization by denoising. That should improve. So this talk was mainly just using expectation maximization, but some other algorithms that are gradient-based might be better suited for regularization by denoising. But there's also a lot of software engineering that needs to go into this. Deep learning packages needs to be put into the Relion package and distributed to users in a convenient way. Also performance and hardware issues, like for instance, now suddenly you need to load a deep learning model into your GPU memory, and that needs to be handled alongside with the memory that Relion uses up. And also library distribution, like QDEN. Now suddenly we need QDNN that the user will have to download themselves. We're hoping to be able to distribute this ourselves, but there are some license issues that might prevent us from doing that. So we'll see how that goes. But ideally, we would like to be able to not extend the pre-requirements of Relion, but distribute all the libraries alongside and sort of automate the installation of those libraries. But what I think would be what I think is quite interesting is how we're going to be packaging these priors. So, and just to give you paint a little view of what I think it's going to look like is that there are probably going to be a bunch of priors that people will train, and those will be distributed by different people, probably a lot by us, for different types of data. For instance, it could be that in the end we train priors specifically for membrane proteins, for instance, that have denoisers that have been trained on specifically membrane proteins and or ribosomes or whatever, or a single prior for all the different biomolecules that you might encounter. And these will have to be packaged in some way and distributed to the user as well. So I can imagine that Relion would be be pre-installed with a few priors, and then the user would be able to download new priors as they come along, and then just plug that into Relion. Yeah, and then finally, I'd like to wrap this up. This project was enabled through a collaboration with our math partners. Also Actum in Stockholm, in Cambridge. He's actually in Stockholm. He's moving to the UK soon. He's been working in the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, and he's PhD student Gustav Sickert. And now Jonas was also working with him, but now moved to DeepMind. And also Carola, that's in Cambridge, the math department at Cambridge University, and her PhD student Sebastian Lunds. And of course, Takanori, that's been very helpful in helping out with a lot of things. And finally, my supervisor, Shaun, for a lot of all the work that he's put into this. Thank you, and I'm ready to take some questions.
Oh, that was great. Thank you very much for that. So our first question is from Ellen Zong, so I'll just unmute her now.
Hi, thanks so much for this talk. I had a question kind of in the middle of the talk, so I think you've addressed some of it, but I was just curious, can you talk a little bit more about what exactly the training data set is? Is it two-dimensional images, or is it the three-dimensional structures? In the case where it's the three-dimensional structures, I'm kind of interested, I guess, how you detect artifacts when you introduce overly strong priors into the reconstruction.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Let me just back up to, yeah, so the reconstructions, so basically I showed you this slide here, right? So the denoiser is, it operates in real space, not in Fourier space. It takes 3D volumes and outputs 3D volumes. So it basically takes your X here, which is your 3D volume, and outputs a 3D volume that gets plugged into this formula here. And what we did was basically taking PDB structures and using a very simple method. We used Eman2 for turning those into a volume. And then we took those volumes and we generated a bunch of 2D images, noisy 2D images that look like cryo-EM images. And then we use Relion to reconstruct those 2D images into 3D volumes. And Relion did the usual thing, generate all these intermediate reconstructions. And all of those intermediate reconstructions, those are these X's. So what we did was we gathered up all of those little reconstructions and we trained our neural network to go from those to the ground truth, to the original image the original volume that we used to generate all of these 2D images, and then subsequently the reconstructed 3D images or 3D volumes. But we also did this other thing where we just took a 3D volume and applied Gaussian noise to it, and then trained a neural network on a denoiser to go from that noisy 3D volume to a pure or a perfect ground truth 3D volume. Hope that answered the question.
Okay, so the next question we have is from Bin. So I'll just ask them to unmute. Okay.
Hi, Dari. Thanks for your presentation. I wonder, what is the specific architecture are you using for training the model for denoising? Because is it UNet or a denoising AE? Because you didn't mention any details about the model or architecture.
Do you mean in the preprint, or do you mean here now?
Here.
Oh yeah, so yeah, so you can sort of refer to the preprint where we specify exactly the all the different blocks that we use. It's a UNet. I don't remember exactly the name. I picked up a UNet and I mentioned that the network, there's a lot of room for improvement on the network, So initially, I just picked a type of denoiser. It's a UNet that is, it's called a residual. Yeah, it's not a residual network. It's a residual unit, I think, because you have a residual connection, a skip connection, across from the input to the output. So you don't actually calculate the output. You calculate the difference between the input and the output, or the difference between the input and the ground truth. But if you look in the preprint, you can. I don't remember the name right now, but it's called a residual denoiser, or a residual UNet, I think.
Okay,
and,
thank you very much.
Yeah, and if it's basically, you can sort of look at the reference there. It's basically, if you combine that with batch normalization, you get kind of the currently one of the best state-of-the-art denoisers out there. So that's why we picked that one specifically.
Sorry, one more question. Are you adding the Gaussian noise to the 3D structures to serve as the training data sets?
Yes, so we did both of these things, and this figure that I'm showing right now shows different results. So if you take Relion reconstructions from 2D images, so you take 2D images and you create 3D volumes out of those. If you use those to train the network, that's when you get the purple line here. So you get better performance. But if you just apply Gaussian noise to your, if you take your ground truth and apply Gaussian noise to that, you still get somewhat of a good performance, but it's not as good as if the denoiser actually gets to see the Relion output that it will later be applied to.
Okay, I see. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great. Our next question is from Pete Meyer.
Hi, Dari. That was a great talk. I have to admit I have not read your preprint, but my question comes from when you were starting talking about the idea of a more intelligent prior. It reminded me very strongly of some of the methods used for density modification in crystallography. And I'm wondering if using something along the lines of the density histograms or the connectivity, analogous, translating those to the EM density, is that something that has been investigated in EM and you folks decided it was better to just go with a neural network? Or I guess, can you comment on why you go with one approach versus the other?
I think
and please let me know if that question made no sense and I should clarify.
No, actually, so I'm not exactly familiar with the different approaches in crystallography, but I can generally just comment. We do see that generally one of the problems in crystallography is that you're doing things in Fourier space, and it's quite difficult. There are these dual approaches where you sort of reconstruct in Fourier space, and then you go to real space, and then you do solvent flattening, or you do something in real space, and then you go back to Fourier space, and you do this iteratively. Those kind of approaches kind of limits application of neural networks because you're not really, it becomes basically, it's very difficult to sort of plug into the heart of the algorithm because it's done in Fourier space. You can train neural networks in Fourier space, of course, but you can't then use convolutional neural networks because simply, you don't have spatial or you don't have local correlation between your pixels in Fourier space in the same way you do in real space. And I think the fact that cryo-EM reconstructions are so, you do your reconstructions in Fourier space, but after all, in the end, you have a full description in real space as well. You can apply convolutional neural networks, and that I think that was the main sort of reason why people haven't really done that in crystallography, where other methods might be more useful. But I think in cryo-EM that this type of approach will probably be more superior compared to other approaches where you kind of handcraft these different, you know, ideas or priors in a sense about how things should look like and adjust things. Yeah, I think that's kind of my answer. I'm not sure.
No, that actually answers my question excellently. I was showing my crystallography bias and assuming that dual space methods were being used everywhere. So,
yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'd just like to thank Dari again for a great talk, and I'm really looking forward to seeing this implemented for real data.
Thank you for having me.